We're here to talk about negotiations, and negotiations has been called both a science and an art. It is something we practice daily, both in our personal as well as our professional lives today. We're going to be, of course, focusing on the professional aspects, at least for the most part. There really is no absolutely right way to negotiate. I think we will discuss this morning some ways we would think are wrong ways to negotiate. We're going to practice on refining negotiation skills, learning some new approaches, developing strategies, and hopefully maybe walk out of here with the idea of becoming a better negotiator. We'll also talk about the elements of what goes into a negotiation, strategies to pursue, and different approaches. We'll conclude with what you do in the end game and how a negotiation is successfully concluded and documented. Dan's going to take us into the elements of negotiation, talk about what it is and why we do it.
Thanks, Paul. So first we'll just start very briefly talking about what is negotiation. And in its simplest terms, there are basically two types of negotiations. Those discussions between two or more parties where the goal is to resolve a dispute. And the other basic type of a negotiation is a discussion between two or more parties where you're trying to reach an agreement on a new opportunity. Examples of negotiations involving dispute resolutions that you might face in your day-to-day business include situations like a dispute with a supplier on the quality of materials, or a dispute with a contractor on not performing up to contract, or a complaint from a homeowner about workmanship or delays. Not to say that anyone in this audience has problems with workmanship or delays, but homeowners can be a tricky group sometimes. And I see on the schedule today that you've got a whole session devoted to customer negotiation, so I'll leave that topic alone. But regardless of whether you're trying to resolve a dispute or negotiate a new contract, successful negotiators have a tendency to view each negotiation as an opportunity to maximize the collective benefits to the parties and minimize the potential downside of the particular negotiation to each party. And that's called aligning interests, and that's a strategy that we'll talk about a little bit later on in the presentation. Elements of negotiation are found in almost every aspect of our daily lives. Just a personal example, I've got twin toddlers at home who just learned how to use the potty, and something I'm very proud of. And if you think that potty training is not a negotiation, then you probably don't have kids. It goes something like this. I'll say, "Do you have to use the potty?" And my child will be dancing around saying, "No." And I'll say, "Well, how come you're dancing around then?" "I don't know." "Why don't you try to use the potty?" "Okay." "Can I have a treat?" "Okay, you can have a treat." "Can I have 2 treats?" "No, just 1." "But I want 2." "How about you have 1 this time and 1 next time you try?" "But I want 2." And this goes around for a couple more rounds of negotiation until my child wets her pants in the kitchen floor as she's standing in front of me negotiating how many treats she's going to get when she ultimately does use the potty. So just a simple example, but that's a negotiation. Hopefully your negotiations don't end with somebody wetting their pants on the kitchen floor. But a lot of the concepts that we're going to talk about today are implicated in that simple example. Knowing what you want, understanding the opposing party and what motivates them. In this case, it's candy. Wouldn't it be nice if all your disputes could be resolved with candy? You get a complaint about some element of your construction, and you say to the customer, "Here's 5 pieces of candy." But not quite that simple. Planning your approach, listening to the other side, observing body language, particularly important in that example. Discuss vigorously, but don't lose your cool. Think about creative ways to solve the problem. Set a trusting and cooperative tone, and looking for ways to align your interests. So that's a little bit about what is negotiation. Why do we do it? We typically engage in negotiations because we want to create something new, or we want to resolve a problem or a dispute. and the parties engaging in the negotiation acknowledge that there's some conflict or interest between them, that they think they can get, they can use some form of influence through the discussion process to get a better deal rather than simply accepting what the other party was willing to give them or resorting to some alternative, such as simply giving in, accepting what the other party is going to give, breaking off the relationship entirely, or resorting to litigation. So that's why we do it. That's why we engage in negotiation. Now, Paul's going to talk about one of the most important parts of negotiation, and that's actually before the negotiation begins, and that's the preparation.
If there's one imperative regarding negotiation, it's to prepare. It's one of the most critical things you can do to best assure a successful outcome in your favor. Items of preparation are, the first may seem kind of self-evident, know what your organization needs and wants, and learn as much as possible, but the other part is learning as much as possible about the needs and wants of your opponent. We usually, but not always, know our own needs and wants, and sitting down and focusing on that is really important before you go into whether it's a property acquisition, services contract, any type of knowing what your organization needs out of that is critical. But having an understanding of the needs and wants of the other side is also critical. The more you know about what is important to them, where their hot buttons are, the best you can perhaps shape and sequence the negotiation to your advantage. Having an idea as to what concessions they may see as having greater value, perhaps to them, than what giving it up does to you, is going to be critical in terms of, again, not that you have to win a negotiation, but coming out feeling that this was something that was worth engaging in, that this is going to be a good deal for you. When you're involved in a negotiation, place emphasis on benefits to the other party. If you're giving something up, don't do it cavalierly. I mean, don't beat it to death, but make sure that the other side does know that there was a concession here. There was some value given. And of course, the quid pro quo is creates an expectation that they will similarly return value at some other point. If possible, present options as opposed to ultimatums. Going into a negotiation says, I got to have this and I got to have it now, really backs the other side into a corner. I mean, nobody likes to be presented with an ultimatum. Instead, if you can present several options which would be acceptable to you, helps to build a collaborative effort, a team effort, as you work through that. The other side doesn't feel so threatened. You're offering options, and it really, again, we're going to be talking about, we're building a relationship here at the table. And the more you do that, the more you're doing it in a collaborative, team-focused approach, the more likely you're going to come out of there, perhaps with a smile on your face and a good outcome. Again, the key thing is preparation, and Dan's going to talk a little bit more about that.
So Paul said it. It's important that you know what you want to get out of the negotiation. Many people enter a negotiation only to find out that they don't have it clear in their own minds what they hope to achieve out of the negotiation. So it's important that you take time at the outset, even before the negotiation begins, to identify not only your desired outcome, but also some fallback positions so that you've got some flexibility as you negotiate. And an effective strategy for doing that is to actually sit down and take the time to write it out, to sort of outline what it is you hope to achieve out of this negotiation. The process of writing it out can actually help you organize your thoughts, and you'll identify some of the weaknesses in your argument. Another thing that outlining your desired outcome can help you accomplish is to prioritize among those alternatives. Paul was saying it's good to have some alternatives and to present some options rather than ultimatums. Engaging in the process of outlining your position helps you prioritize your alternatives so that you know where you want to end up, but also where you have some flexibility. For instance, if you're going in for a meeting with a plan commission on a new project, and there are maybe a couple of different zoning designations or or densities that would work for your project. You might have your first preferred alternative, but there are some options that you've analyzed in advance that you know could work for you. So you've done your preparation, and you understand what your options are, so that when you're in that meeting and you can see that it's that you're not going to get the maximum density that you were hoping for, you know right away what your alternatives are. Plan B, okay, I'm going to this, and I can keep the discussion, the negotiation moving forward, because I've done my homework and I know what's acceptable. If I'm not getting my first preferred, I have alternatives, and I've already prepared that in advance. Another strategy, as you're preparing for your negotiation and thinking about what you want, is to consider whether there are alternatives for a negotiated resolution. For instance, when you're in a dispute that you're trying to resolve, think about whether you're prepared to litigate that dispute.
Or go to arbitration.
Or go to arbitration to get the objective that you're after. Or in the situation where you're trying to negotiate a new business opportunity, you need to put some thought in advance to whether or not you're willing to simply walk away from that opportunity, throw your hands up and say, okay, I'm done, and end the relationship and look to the next deal. Is that an option or not in your situation? Something that should be considered before you get into it. And so when you consider all these options in advance, doing that helps you understand and identify where your bottom line is. And it's something that we process sort of instinctively or subconsciously. We do these types of negotiations or these calculations. We sort of factor these things all the time, and we're always thinking about this. But an effective technique for improving your negotiation skills is to give that some conscious thought. Sit down and think about your objectives, prioritize them, figure out what your alternatives are, consider if there are any options that aren't available to you, and having that clear understanding of the paybacks and the consequences makes it easier for you to determine how and when to make concessions as the negotiation progresses, and when you've hit your bottom line. And knowing where that bottom line is critical, because it lets you know when it's time to stop, when you've gotten what you're after. I can't tell you how many times I've been at a meeting, it's a plan commission or a village board meeting late at night, and the client sitting next to me is going on, and I have to reach over and grab his arm and say, okay, I think you can stop now. I think we got what we want. And these people, their eyes are glazing over, and I'm pretty sure that guy over there has been sleeping for the last half an hour, so we can stop now. So know your bottom line, and it also helps you know when there's something on the table that you can't agree to.
Two things. One, I was once before the Planning and Zoning Committee, and before I was about ready to start a very thought-out presentation, the chair looked at me and says, we're going to approve this. Do you want to say anything? I said, no, I don't want to keep my mouth shut. The second thing is that in prioritizing and knowing your bottom line, flowing off of what Dan said, and I'm sure I'm not letting any great revelations here, coming in and being prepared to ask for more than really what you may even expect to get makes a lot of sense. Density of a subdivision, condominium project. But I guess I've always felt that there's kind of in any negotiation, there's a credibility issue. And if you can't get something out of your mouth with a straight face because it really is so outlandish and so far afield from what is legitimately reasonable, that you sacrifice credibility, and once that's gone, it's awfully hard to overcome it. It also tends to polarize positions. The other side digs their heels in, and whether it's a purchase price negotiation, density, whatever it is, once you take a very unreasonable, it takes a long time for that pendulum to move back. Moving on to the next element, we talked a little bit at the outset about knowing the opposition and anticipating reactions, objections, and responses. All of us, and I think lawyers are probably more guilty than anybody else, have a tendency to fall in love with our own arguments. We tend to believe our position is so compelling, our argument's so brilliant, we're just going to blow the other side out of the water. And there's a word for that, and it's called delusional. Rather, it really makes a lot more sense to learn as much as you can about the other side. What do they want? What do they want? What are their strengths and weaknesses? And then put yourself in their position and say, now, if I was attacking you, or I was attacking me, where are my weaknesses? Where's my Achilles heel? Where am I most vulnerable? And the more you think about what they need, the more you think of where your weaknesses might be, the best you can prepare and really, truly, critically analyze your position, your presentation, prioritize where your individual issues may line up, and it's a big part of a successful negotiation. All of this requires a fair amount of effort and thought and preparation, but will ultimately make you a better and more effective negotiator. We'll also talk about power and how that can play into a negotiation.
Well, it's important that you understand the source of your power, your bargaining position, that of the other party, and you understand that that power dynamic. There are often power plays in a negotiation, and being mindful of the respective bargaining positions of the parties makes it easier to shift away from those power plays. And a good way to do that is, instead of focusing on the power or the disparity of power between the parties, especially if you're the little guy, is to focus on aligning the interests of the parties. For instance, if you're in a negotiation with a major land developer for the purchase of a package of lots, and you think you're the little guy, and they're the big guys, and they've got all the power, and you're being pushed around. Well, instead of focusing on that power dynamic, shift it around, focused on aligning the interests of the parties, keep the discussion focused on the common goals. You say, look, you want to sell these lots to be successful in your business, just like I need to purchase these lots to be successful in mine. It's clear you want to sell and I want to buy. Let's focus on that and keep the discussion moving forward that way.
And if you can kind of figure out where that both parties are benefited, and the example that Dan was just talking about, obviously the developer is not only selling to you, he's seeking to sell to potential end users and other spec builders or others, if we start getting back into a construction mode anyway. And having construction activity in that subdivision is going to stimulate further activity. Having somebody in on the front end starting to dig some holes and putting up some houses is going to help his other sales, and reminding him of that or her of that is something, again, bringing it back to an interest. Where are your interests aligned in this negotiation? How can you best say, hey, wait, again, it's a collaborative team focus, as opposed to, well, he's got all the money. I need to do this to, again, feed my family.
Right. So think about those power sources, time, money, scale, but then try to shift away from those and get back to aligning the interests. And Paul's going to talk about some of the more important, or at least more prevalent power sources in a negotiation: time and money.
And we've often heard that time is money, but when you can, and certainly this is not always possible, but try to schedule a negotiation, particularly something that's critical to you, so it's not sandwiched in between other important matters. Again, what does it come back to? It comes back to preparation. It doesn't take an Einstein to figure out that you're going to have too many balls in the air at the same time. For instance, if you're looking at doing a development within a community that's going to be, maybe you're looking for some TIF financing, maybe you're looking for certain densities, you're certainly not going to come in and try to get the planner's attention on the afternoon of the Plan Commission at where you're going to make your presentation. I mean, starting out early on, recognizing who are the important players in the community, getting the planning staff on your side, again, building some consensus there, finding out who plays an important role. Is it the village president, the mayor? Does the alderman in this particular community wield any power? Is that somebody you need to build an alliance with? And then when you're going to, and as you're going through this is really just a protracted negotiation, a protracted dance. But building this, and so that when you're going to the floor of the Plan Commission, you know the people who are sitting up there, you know you're going to make your presentation, you have some sense of where the heat's going to come from, perhaps in some adjacent property owners who may be disturbed about additional traffic. Gee, I moved out here when my subdivision was built, and I always wanted the rural atmosphere to stay forever. Preparation is critical, timing is critical for the negotiation, but time is also, and not the time involved in preparation, but time pressures. If I am sitting on some property and I've got a foreclosure, papers have just been served on me, I'm kind of between a rock and a hard place, and somebody looking at coming and negotiating with me as to perhaps bailing me out, or not necessarily to help me out, but really to, I guess only the government does that, but to buy this at a discount. If they know how dire my consequences are, that's going to make my position awfully, awfully tenuous. Instead, if you can conceal that due, try to, if time is an element, if you can avoid showing that, that's great. If you can find out that the other side does have those kinds of issues, it does give you some greater power. And the next one is money. Economic resources are like time. If you have them, you're in the catbird seat. You're driving the negotiation. And for instance, if you're a developer and you're trying to put something together and you've already bought the land and you're paying interest on the loan, you want to start turning that into inventory, starting to turn that into cash. And that puts you at a disadvantage. So the better holding power you have, the better you are equipped to perhaps stay in the dance a little longer.
The next slide talks about planning your approach. So I think you can probably see a theme developing here, and that's preparation. All that we've talked about so far has been about preparation, getting ready for the negotiation, putting the time in up front so that you're more successful on the back end. And so planning your approach to the actual negotiation itself is important. You might have certain preconceptions about the party that you're negotiating with. The other party might have a certain reputation for being difficult to deal with. Maybe the other party to the negotiation has a reputation for being completely unreasonable, as is the case with certain municipalities around here, but I'll leave my personal opinions out of it. You might even have a long-standing relationship with the other party you're negotiating with, and that has an impact on how you're going to handle the negotiation. Is this a one-time deal, or is there an opportunity to parlay this into something long-term? All of this needs to be factored into the approach that you're going to take. And these considerations, they really go to the heart of what we're talking about here, which is the preparation. Another part of the planning your approach to the negotiation is to think about some of the ethical issues. There's certain things that just are to be avoided, that should be just completely off the table. An example of that in a negotiation is a personal attack on the other side. It's just not something you should be engaging in. You might have personal information about someone, the other side that you're negotiating with, and there might be certain circumstances where it's appropriate for you to use that to your negotiating advantage, but not always. An example of where it might be appropriate is, say you're negotiating with somebody, and you know that they, really lost their shirt on that last deal, and they're hurting for cash, and they're eager to make a deal this time, and using that information about their personal situation, is appropriate.
But you have to be careful as to how you do it. I mean, doing that in order to be effective and without antagonizing the other person, if I was looking to do that, I'd probably do it in an empathetic way. Starting out by saying, gee, I heard what happened to you down in Franklin. That was tough to handle. I'm sure that probably put a squeeze on you. That lets the other person know that you know, but at the same time, you're not twisting the knife, as it were.
So in addition to thinking about preconceptions about the other party that you're dealing with, thinking about the ethical issues, sequencing is another important consideration in planning your approach to the negotiation, especially when you have multiple issues to deal with. And we'll talk more in just a little bit about sequencing some of the negotiations so that you can get agreement on certain issues right up front. That really it's an effective technique for setting the tone of the negotiation, especially if it's going to be a protracted negotiation. So we'll talk about that in a minute. But sequencing, you should give some thought to that. What issues are you going to tackle first? What happens when you hit an impasse? If you're in the midst of a negotiation and you get stuck on an issue, do you set it aside? Or do you stick to that outline that you prepared for yourself of the way that you wanted to proceed with this negotiation? Sometimes, and it depends on the circumstances. Sometimes it'll be effective to set that issue aside and move on to something else. Other times it doesn't make any sense to do that. You're negotiating a lease, and the parties aren't in the same ballpark on something as critical as some of the economic terms, base rent. Well, does it really make sense to go on and negotiate the other finer points of that lease, like the insurance provisions or what happens in the event of casualty? Probably not, because you're never going to get there. So in those circumstances, you need to stay with the tough issues and work through them. In other situations, it can be a real effective technique to set something aside if you get stuck on it. In those situations, you can see that the parties' interests are aligned, things are progressing, you're making progress on the overall goal here, but you get hung up on something. Maybe you're negotiating a purchase agreement, and you're close on price. You've talked about some of the other big picture economic type terms, and you get stuck on something like costs. Who's going to pay for a survey or something like that? Well, you can see that this is a deal that you both want to do. So you say, okay, we'll get back to those cost issues. Let's talk about something else. And you keep your momentum that way. You don't let some minor point drag you down. And you'll find that you work through another issue. Maybe that momentum keeps building, and you finally do come back to that issue you were stuck on, and magically it seems to be a little easier at that point to work things out. Sometimes it works that way, sometimes it doesn't, but you can try that as a strategy. Finally, as you're planning your approach to the negotiation, think about certain other strategies that you might want to use. When you start the negotiation, how do you want to make your first shot? Do you want to start out with some extreme position, thinking that they're going to start out at some extreme position, and the parties are going to do that old thing where they sort of split the difference till they meet in the middle? That might not be the most effective strategy in a lot of circumstances. Some people are turned off by that. They don't like that haggling. But that's not to say that you want to necessarily start out with your bottom line. Here's what I need, this is what I want, and that's it. Because if you do that, then you've left yourself no room to negotiate. And getting back to what Paul was saying at the outset of the presentation, negotiation's an art as much as a science. It's a process, and both parties need to be engaged in the process. They need to feel like they participated in the process, that they really got something of value out of the process of negotiation. So if you start from your bottom line position, the other party can't really participate in that process, and they don't feel like they're really getting something out of it. It gets into the psychology a little bit, but think about that, where you're going to start from. Sticking with my planning examples, you go into a new community, and how are you going to first present your project? You've got this great new building that you're proposing. Do you come in with fully developed plans, exactly the way that you want it? You've been working on this concept, this development for months. Do you come in with everything fully fleshed out? Put it on the planner's desk and say, here's what it is? Or would it be more effective if you went in with some conceptual plans, even if you've gone through all the sort of design iterations, you know where you want to end up, you've done your pro forma, you know what your budget is, you got all the details, and you know you've done your planning, you've done your homework, you know what your outline is, what your goals are, where you want to end up. But where you start in the negotiation is with some conceptual plans. You hold back a little bit and say, here's what I'm proposing, what do you think? And you leave it sort of open-ended, and that lets the municipality sort of give you some of their input. This is what we like to see in our community. And when you come back the next time and your plans reflect that, reflect what you were told, it gives you a lot of credibility, like you were listening. And they feel like you're really committed to the process. So some people take that to an extreme and say, well, maybe if I come in with garbage the first time, which is an example of an extreme sort of unreasonable position, and then you say, well, the next time I come in with something better, I'll look like a champion. I don't necessarily advocate that. I think it's better if you just come in, hold back a little bit rather than sort of trying to present something that you're not really intending to do, and let the process take place, let the discussion take place, and incorporate the feedback as you go along.
So somewhere between a cocktail napkin and construction drawings, which kind of keys into what I'm going to be talking about, which is the medium, or how we communicate. What do we choose to do? Probably the most conventional three ways we do this are face-to-face meetings, telephone, or written communication, which today, more often than not, is going to be email. Dan and I are often involved in lease negotiations, purchase contracts, financing transactions, development agreements, where drafts are circulated back and forth. And so you try to, and particularly folks like us who bill by the hour and charge you by the hour, cost becomes a major issue in how to do that. So you have to look at cost and cost effectiveness when you're choosing how you do things. I think face-to-face is almost always better than any other, but it's also the most costly. If you've got the other parties out of state, particularly, you're talking about flying, time involved, perhaps overnight. Even if it's in the same community, there's that travel factor. And email does make things so much easier. But in doing it, you have to kind of, again, getting back to that I guess our mantra tonight, today, about negotiations being an art, it's something that you grab or get a feel for. Dan had mentioned about people who have a reputation for being unreasonable or obstructionist. That's a lot easier to do over a phone. It's even easier to do by email. And often if you get that person in a room and they're forced to look you in the eye, and it's certainly not universally true, and I can come up with some examples, but it's a lot harder to take that sort of absolutist, unreasonable position. So I guess my own style is when I'm involved in something, I would rather get, if there's some understanding as to economic deals, whether that's reached by a conference call, exchange of letters of intent, some sort of basic, you have some basic deal structure, some of the economics have been fleshed out, but there's a lot of meat to be put on those bones. And so then develop an agreement and circulate that. And the reaction to that agreement is going to tell me a lot in terms of where we're going and the best way to continue this relationship. Again, I'm big on being cost effective and trying to do it by email. Once you exchange drafts, continually sending volleys over the other side's bow often is wasteful. And so getting on the telephone and trying to work through these things is often the most effective way. But then you come to the point where it seems to make sense to get people in the room. If lawyers are involved, the lawyers and the decision makers, the clients, and everybody sit down and have an all-hands meeting, and nobody goes to the bathroom until we come out with a resolution. Again, there's no right way, but there can be some wrong ways. One kind of cautionary note about email, and I grew up or started this business before email was being used, so maybe I'm more
Before Al
sensitized to
Gore
it.
invented the internet.
Oh yeah, before Al Gore, yeah, that's true. But I often see emails, particularly from younger people who I think are, grew up text messaging, et cetera, which really seem kind of cold and impersonal and you can see a flavor of sarcasm. And I don't think it's always intended. It can mean just to be concise and to the point, but it can be misinterpreted. And you don't have the nuance, the inflection that you have if you're on the phone or sitting in the same room with somebody. So I think, reading an email a second time before it goes out, particularly if you get a contract or a proposal in and you're thinking, my God, what is that person smoking? And then you fire off your comments, you can really throw gas on a fire and the ball's just not advanced. So looking at your email, maybe starting out with, gee, we haven't done anything together for 18 months, how's the kids? And then then get into it, and even if you use a bullet point type approach, I looked at your proposal and I have these issues. Getting that kind of foot in the door psychologically, if you will, can go a long way to disarming and perhaps personalizing that email and that communication, and perhaps making this a more productive process. One of the other things that is challenging often in negotiation is when you're forced to deal with somebody without authority. And sometimes this is done deliberately, could be to develop a junior person. Sometimes it's done as a strategy, where a decision maker will interpose somebody without authority as kind of sending the first line of soldiers who gets cut down in a battle. But it often is inefficient from your perspective. And so if you can, and understand as much as you can about the hierarchy of a particular organization, find out who is an authority and not waste a lot of time or deal capital in a negotiation with somebody that it is nothing more than a dress rehearsal. Dan, you want to talk a little bit about structure?
Sure. Mentioned it just briefly a couple of minutes ago, but one good technique for getting the negotiation going and ultimately getting some agreement on the large issues that you're after is to structure the negotiation so that you get some agreement on lesser points, minor issues right up front. Initial agreement on those minor issues helps to get the interests aligned, get the heads nodding in agreement right up front, sets the tone for the discussion to follow, and really creates a positive environment that's going to benefit you over the course of the negotiation. I don't want to get too deep into the psychology of this, but if you can present a couple of points, even something as simple as, okay, look, I know we've got this, I think we can both agree that we've got a problem here, and we both want to resolve it. People start doing this, and that kind of, agreement can carry through onto some of the bigger issues. So it can be an effective technique to structure things so that you get the little issues up front, you start building some agreement, aligning the interests, and that can carry through to the bigger issues. Another way to get agreement early on is to consider exchanging issue lists. Each party comes up with their list of issues, particularly if the negotiation is complex. Exchange those lists. Maybe you'll look at those and you'll see that there's some areas where you can agree right away. Get those out of the way, and you're left focusing on the big issues.
That's not something that you do a lot of, but I have done it a few times, and it can be effective. And where I've seen it come into play is where there may be a sale of a business with perhaps some continuing supply obligations, with a real estate transfer, and where you're going to have this continuing relationship, and it's not one deal. It's, there are several things, and you're building this house of cards, all interdependent upon each other. But getting that on paper and exchanging that paper and having a sense of, this is what we're going to talk about, and this is what we would like to get out of it, really makes a lot of sense when you get into that more complex transaction.
Another thing to keep in mind is that you shouldn't be afraid to ask for what you're really after. People often fail to raise issues in a negotiation because they think that they don't have any chance of success. And my advice would be, don't be afraid. Good negotiators ask for everything that they want. And they've done their preparation, so they know what it is they want. They ask for it, and they make sure that they don't end up with things that they don't want. And tying this all together, the preparation is really the key to that. So you want to be explicit with the other party. I'm sure you've all been in a negotiation where you feel like the other party is kind of hiding the ball, and they're dancing around certain issues. And it's really tough to get agreement when you're not being direct. And I'm not suggesting that you should be direct to the point of being rude or too blunt, because you always have to maintain a certain amount of diplomacy in a negotiation. But deal directly with the other party. And listen to the other side. Good negotiators are good listeners and good communicators, not just good talkers, as my 3-year-olds are. They talk a mile a minute, and they don't listen. So by listening, observing behavior, body language, if you're in a face-to-face meeting, being attentive, you can really learn a lot about the other party and what their position is. You can learn a lot about where they think or where their weaknesses might be, and where you might have some opportunities. And you'll also learn a lot by asking good open-ended questions. You're in a discussion, a conversation with the other party. Don't treat it as a cross-examination where you're trying to nail them on issues. If you ask some open-ended questions, you might discover some things that you didn't know before, and you might find opportunities that you didn't know existed in this relationship with the other party. So ask some good questions. Listen. Don't be afraid to ask questions in general. Especially if you're dealing with a party on the other side that you might think is more experienced than you, and you don't want to sort of reveal your ignorance by asking questions. Don't do it. If there's something that you don't understand, you need to ask and get that out, and you shouldn't be afraid to do that. Otherwise, you're going to have problems. Be willing to brainstorm with the other party about ideas. This gets to something we'll talk about in a moment, but creativity. Just be open to that with the other side. Really do listen. The other party might have, the person sitting across the table from you might have issues that they're dealing with that might not be directly related to the negotiation at hand, but might have some bearing on it. They report to somebody, they've got a boss, maybe they've got some marching orders, things that they can't, they've got no flexibility. Listen for that and watch for that. Try to show some empathy. And if you do that, you'll have a better chance of finding that common ground where the interests are aligned and making some headway. So really do think of it, the negotiation, as something you're engaged in with the other party, collaboratively trying to solve a problem.
You remember that last slide? This is the one he gives me. I was actually the guy on the left here in an earlier life before my hair got gray. It's easy to get emotional in a negotiation. And I personally am somebody who can be aggressive. I believe in discussing vigorously. But you can't get lost. You can't let the emotion take it over. When we embark on a negotiation, there's some sense of going to war. We kind of gird up our loins by preparing and marshaling our arguments. We develop our strategies. We talk about endgame strategies and where we're willing to sacrifice, what we're willing to give up to get even greater advantages. In a way, it does kind of sound like a general going to battle, but the best generals are those that keep the wits about them when the bullets start flying and that don't lose their cool. And so in a negotiation, it's very easy to have opportunities where this perspective is lost. A bit of sarcasm here, veiled insult there, and all of a sudden it's away from the issues and it's getting personal. And people are not so concerned with what is going to be a negotiated result, but scoring points. And when you get to that kind of point in a negotiation, it's time to step back and perhaps take a time out. Negotiations can be tough, but they should be issue focused, not personality focused. They shouldn't be arguments. We talked about sequencing earlier. That can be important in terms of controlling the emotions of a negotiation. If you do some of that consensus building earlier, when you know where the big 800-pound gorilla is, that you're going to have to come to and deal with at some point, being able to position that in such a way that perhaps you built some relationship with your opponent before getting to it may get you through that tougher issue and let you conclude the negotiation. And probably most importantly, and really difficult perhaps for lawyers sometimes, is to leave ego out of it. I mean, really what you should be doing is looking at what is the bottom line, what is advancing, what is, again, having focused on it on the front end, and what is it you're looking to achieve, what are you prepared to accept, and get that and not worry about the point scoring.
And another thing you can do in a negotiation, what you should do, is be looking for creative ways to solve the problem. To the extent possible, think in terms of long-term strategic business vision. Think about your goals and how that all fits into the larger negotiation context. It's not something you can do on every negotiation. There's not always going to be an opportunity for other opportunities in a negotiation. But putting things into the larger perspective helps you conceptualize of it a little bit differently. If you're always focused on the immediate short-term gain, winning on this point, you're going to lose out on other opportunities that are there that you're just not seeing because you're so nearsighted. You're so focused on, negotiating for the lowest price possible on this, on this land. But you're in that situation where you're negotiating with that big land developer, and you think that your most important thing is the price. Well, maybe you're not thinking strategically about the long-term advantage of both parties, and you miss an opportunity here. Instead of really driving the hardest bargain possible on that price of that first lot, take a step back, look at the big picture, see where your interests are aligned, and say, I need to do this first lot, but if I'm successful here in this subdivision, I'm going to be back. So let's talk about maybe negotiating an option for another 5 lots as part of this first one. Look for those opportunities to maximize the collective benefits to the parties, minimize the potential losses. So take your interests, your long-term business goals, and think about ways that you can attack the problem collaboratively. And again, this isn't a technique that you can use in every situation, but something to watch for. Are there opportunities here that I can take advantage of?
And one of the ways to do that is, again, setting a trusting, cooperative tone. It probably sound kind of new age up here, but it really does work if you're taking something where you can be aggressive, but you're still looking at working collaboratively, working towards something that's a reasonable resolution for both sides. Focus on what's really important to you and the needs of your business, and again, not just positions. If you start out tough, tense, and adversarial, it's very likely you're going to inspire the same sort of reaction on the other side. Nobody likes to be perceived as a wimp. If somebody comes in and they're, again, banging the fist on the table, and you're inspired to do the same. You don't want to be backed down. You don't want to be perceived as weak. And so it's it's recognizing that that is your likely response is a good way of saying, hey, maybe I should start out that way. Don't be afraid to be resolute, confident, but at the same time coming out and demeaning people or coming out and being super aggressive, hostile, it just doesn't really work in most cases. On the other hand, we talked about power and leverage. If you've got all the resources, well then perhaps you can afford to act like a jerk. Most of us are not in that position, at least not all the time. Next deal. One of my best clients always, and this is similar to what Dan was talking about, said that the best way to resolve any current problems, and he had the capacity to administer a lot of construction and hire a lot of contractors, was focusing not on what the problem was today, but what was the next deal, what was the opportunity, where were we going to be working together in the future. And if there is a problem today, and if that problem seems huge, starting to get away and back away and getting that perspective and thinking about long-term again is really to both sides' advantage, and it's a tremendous stress and tension reliever. Seek opportunities. We all talk about win-win resolutions. It's often cited, and sometimes it's even possible. Use creative thinking. Where do we have potential other opportunities? Where might we make this opportunity a little better? Thinking about it can go a long way, and getting the other side to think about it with you to help resolve the current problem. Empathize. That can't be actually, I went to UWM 100 years ago, and something that stuck with me is somebody had put in spray paint, always be sincere, even if you don't mean it. I'm not going there, but empathy is something. You don't have to necessarily agree with somebody to appreciate where they're coming from and understand where they're coming from. There are a few things as frustrating as believing that the other side just has no ability or has not even tried to understand your issues, your problems. It doesn't mean they're going to agree with you, but we all like to be understood at some level. The agreement's nice if you can get it, but understanding is pretty critical towards building trust. And sometimes it's really, really helpful in a negotiation, particularly if you know it's going to be a difficult one, to come up and make a unilateral concession at the start. Something that may not mean a lot to you, but something that may mean quite a bit to the other side. We're Wisconsin. We all like freebies. If I'm in a land negotiation with somebody, say an older person who's probably would really like to stay in the farmhouse, selling the farm today, I know that they're probably bound for assisted living in not too distant future. Having the ability to perhaps develop a subdivision or a project around them and give them the ability where the money is in the bank, they still have some right to live in their house for a year, 2 years, 3 years, can mean an awful lot. And it's not giving up that much on the part of my client, but the tremendous value that it is to them really will go a long way when you get to some of the things about how many dollars per acre. Because you're building that trust early on. It's a concession that was made. It's one that you certainly want to, again, not beat it to death, but make sure they understand how significant a concession it is. And that should go a long way to building a foundation for bigger issue resolution. And I think anybody who's in any way a social human being understands finding points of common interest. If you're going into a situation which you know is going to be emotionally charged, spending a few minutes talking about stuff other than the stuff you came to talk about can mean an awful lot. It's a way of perhaps diffusing some emotions, again, building some sort of team sense, whether it's bowling, sports. You notice that he's got some decal on his truck that indicates he's a deer hunter. Some sort of discussion about things other than what you came to talk about on the front end. You start to get friendly, and that's a good thing. Which kind of builds into sometimes the pace of the negotiation can be critical.
Sure. You've done your preparation. You've started off the negotiation on the right tone. Now you got to control the pace of the negotiation. Different people have different speeds at which they like to engage in negotiation. Some people do like that back and forth. Haggling drives other people nuts. So look for it. Watch the signs you're getting from the other party. Resist the urge to get to the bottom line too quickly, because again, this is a process, and it might take some time, but both parties need to engage in the process in order for both parties to feel like they got something out of it. So if you move too fast, you can sometimes destroy that trust that you're building, and wreck the momentum that you're building. But taking it slowly has its drawbacks too. It can be more costly to you, and it might result in a deal slipping away. So try to watch the pace of the negotiation. And one last point there is to remember your fallback plans. Remember your options that you prepared for yourself, so that if you get in a situation where the pace just stops and you hit a roadblock, you can think about your alternatives to keep things moving. And in those situations, where things come to a standstill, think about silence as a tool. Many people feel compelled to jump in. You're in an argument, and all of a sudden there's that awkward, that pause in the negotiation. The conversation stops, and a lot of people want to jump in and fill that with more talking. So practice holding back. Resist the urge to do that, especially if you're the one that just put the offer on the table and you're not getting an immediate response. Silence is okay. It's a good tool. Once you make an offer, you got to wait for the response. Otherwise, you're going to be negotiating against yourself, and that's not a position where you want to be. You're not going to win in that situation. So by just taking a step back, letting the silence be okay, and just waiting, you avoid the possibility that you're weakening your position and negotiating against yourself. If you don't wait, it encourages the other party to be the one that's waiting. If they see that you're going to jump in and sort of say, okay, well, I said $5,000 an acre. How about 5,500? Well, then the other party's going to see that. They're going to, if they're a good negotiator, observe what it is that you're doing. They're going to watch you, and they're going to use that to their advantage, and maybe slow the negotiation down, and maybe they've got time on their side, and things really start stacking up against you. So if you're the one making the offer, just wait and let the silence be okay, and see what the response is before you jump in and start negotiating against yourself.
Kind of talking about a slight variation. I don't know how many times people in this audience find themselves in it, but occasionally you find yourself into a negotiation which is not just a one-on-one, where there are multiple parties involved. Situations where I've been involved might have a developer where you're doing a project. Project may be located within one municipality but receiving utilities from a second. What does that mean in terms of the two municipalities? Are you going to put yourself in a position of promising things to this same thing to two different entities? It's something that I kind of think of, I hate the military analogies again, but fighting a two-front war, particularly if you know one side is being unreasonable, or perhaps both. And so you're trying to get both of them to be reasonable, and you're the one that's trying to kind of take the sharp edges off. Probably an area that I see it a lot in is if you own let's say an income project, an office project, or a retail project, and you're refinancing that project, and you've got some anchor tenants who, they're called anchors because they have some power too. And your lender is looking for things in a subordination agreement from that tenant. And quite often, lenders will seek to perhaps retool the leases so they're more favorable to the extent the lender ever takes the project back because you forgot to mail a check. And letting that lender's first draft go out directly to the tenant often has that, all of a sudden the world is ending, the tenant is ticked off, I'm not going to even look at this. Being able to facilitate that, insulate it, bring it back to a reasonable approach, at the same time negotiating with the tenant, you're trying to get everybody to be reasonable, and you may not even have that much of a dog in that particular fight. But being able to act as almost a mediator between those two parties, because you do have a definite interest, but it's not your rights that are being eroded, can go a long way towards making that have a successful and an earlier outcome than it might otherwise have. That, of course, requires some additional work, additional preparation, spending the time on the front end to understand each party's position. What are they likely to look at? Again, putting yourself in the shoes of the other party or both other parties. The more you can anticipate, plan, and strategize with respect to each of the parties is going to, again, make an early and successful outcome more likely. Which kind of brings us both to talking about endgames and towards the end of this presentation. Dan, you want to start out?
Sure. Okay, so you've gone through this process. You've done your preparation. You've successfully engaged in the negotiation. You've achieved your objectives, and you see that things are coming to a conclusion here. What next? And this is a really critical part of the negotiation process. The preparation is important. The strategy you use in the negotiation is important, but it's also important what you do at the end of it, because you don't want this to be wasted. You don't want all of your effort to be for naught. So you want to summarize the outcome. You want to think about the resolution that you reached, the points of agreement that you have. Are there any open issues that you decided that you would set aside for another day? Separate negotiation, and make sure that you really do have an agreement between the parties. Make sure that everyone's on the same page, and the way to do that is to write it down. And that's something that where we get involved. Maybe the parties, our clients, have negotiated a resolution of a particular issue, and they've come to some terms, and then they need to get some agreement drafted between them. And the party that controls the drafting of that agreement can have an advantage. You have to be faithful to the deal, the agreement that was reached, but there are some advantages in controlling that drafting process to make sure that you accurately reflect what was agreed to, and don't let anything else new creep into the agreement at that point. If it does, it really sets you back. If you start raising new issues at the end, you're going to open up the issues that you thought you had settled.
And one of the best ways to avoid that kind of problem, again, where you take unfair advantage of being a drafter, is before you leave the table, perhaps taking lead in verbally summarizing what you understand the parties' positions to be, that this is what we've agreed today, and kind of take careful notes, and obviously you're not going to hit every single minutia, but hit the major points and make sure that the heads are nodding, and then volunteer to take the lead in documenting that. You got the buy-in at the table, and then you go ahead, and then you have to be faithful, as Dan said. You have to be faithful to the deal that was struck. If you start trying to be cute when you're going through the drafting exercise, you're just undermining what was accomplished. People are going to perceive you as less than ethical, and you wasted a lot of time. And then I guess the final thing is then kind of what you touched on earlier. Is there anything that the deal is contingent upon? If it's a purchase contract, are there contingencies for a rezoning? Are there contingencies for financing? Those have to be built into the agreement, getting those out on the table. So there's a clear understanding at the table of what other things have to happen in order for this deal to come together, so that, again, there isn't this, where did this come from? I was blindsided. I thought we had a deal. If you can avoid that, then you should have successfully concluded your negotiation, and hopefully we've tried to conclude ours. So, is there anybody who has any questions? Yes, sir. Okay.
If you have two parties and one has done something wrong,
Okay.
okay, so now you have to negotiate, let's say, a monetary,
Mm-hmm.
does that change your look at all the negotiations? Is that a different whole process, or, I mean, are parts of this going into that, obviously, but,
You and I are partners. You discover that I've been skimming. That kind of
let's just
thing?
say there was a wrongdoing, not necessarily of that, due to neglect of somebody's workmanship?
Well, yeah, I understand where you're coming from. There's a little bit of righteousness that you feel. You say, you know, we wouldn't be sitting here if you'd done your stupid job. And, and that is something that, but I guess turning it around, is that going to be, it may be a productive in some cases if you know the person and you know that everybody's treated them that way, that's the way they're used to be treated that way, and you'll never hire them again, and that's the reason you're having this discussion. I mean, can things change? Yes. Again, the old art-science dichotomy, there are no absolutes. I think generally, though, that you can do some of where you rub the dog's nose in it, in that this is what you did. This is our problem. This is what we're here to address. I can pay you, or you can fix it, or I can hold back from what I owe you and pay somebody who knows what they're doing to fix it. I mean, that is a negotiation you can have, and it's obviously got a lot of sublayers in terms of basically you just told the person they're incompetent. Now, they may be incompetent, but is there a better way to get your, what your result is? What are you looking for? If you're looking for them to fix it, and you're saying, now listen, because you created this problem, the people who put in the carpeting and the other people, the wall coverings that came after you, all of that has to be redone. And that's going to come out of your contract amount. And if you can tell me why I shouldn't, I mean, there is a defect here. This was a defect within the walls that you created. And if you can tell me why I can't, why this is somehow unjust or inequitable, I'd like to hear it. Because right now, I see this as a problem that you created, which created a lot of other problems. And by that, I mean being aggressive, but also being fair. Calling somebody incompetent probably isn't going to get anywhere, I don't think. Am I missing the boat, or?
No, it's, I guess, I didn't want to get too deep into the scenario.
Okay.
Somebody didn't do their job properly, but that, it's a large company, okay, so it's somebody that worked for them that properly did the job. Now, they were paid for that job. Now, to rectify their situation at the timing aspect of it was somebody else was there, so there's money that's been paid, everything's done. Now we're back to square one, we're back to the original company saying, okay, I had to spend X amount of dollars to rectify what you guys screwed up.
And
So now that's the negotiation.
And I think one of the earlier slides that we had was, you know, when you're approaching a negotiation, consider your other alternatives. And if you have a contract that provides for arbitration, I mean, I would first try to sit down, because why incur the additional expense of going through an arbitration, going through litigation? Those are expensive things. Look at what the cost of those might be, but then you look at how many dollars are we talking about? Because you mentioned everybody was paid, but there's a fix required, and that fix is going to cost money. And so when you do your preparation, you sit down and say, okay, this is how much is at stake. This is the dollar amount. It's $34,000 it's going to take to repair the problem. What's it going to cost? I have a binding arbitration provision in my construction agreement with the sub. And what is it going to cost to go through arbitration? I think I'm going to win. I may not get everything. Every arbitrator thinks they're Solomon. They want to cut the baby in half. So is that going to be part of the results? So you take a look at that. Okay, I'm probably not going to get the 34, but it was pretty bad. So I'm going to get 25, 28 grand. What are the costs of the arbitration? Okay, that. Then you know what your alternative cost is. Then I would sit down with them. And I mean, I probably would be more aggressive in that situation. I would be prepared. I would have a very itemized. There's often, I've been in negotiations on this type of thing where a client, and even though they said they were going to bring all the backup, didn't quite do it. And they remember there was this cost and they think there was that cost. I love it when you can just have a list and you can have invoices and you can have something that's itemized and detailed and you can set it down. I'm not a believer in saving thunder for some later battle. I believe in if you give it your best shot out of the box. This is what we're talking about. This is exactly what maybe not incompetence, but this is what you cost me. It's right here. If you have a dispute, let's go down it item by item. But this is what I'm out. Now I want you to explain to me why you shouldn't write a check right now. Now, if I'm on the other side, I'm thinking, I know about, again, I've put myself in your shoes, and I know what the arbitration is going to cost. I know that there's going to be some discount on the result. I know, in representing that incompetent contractor or sub, that there's something less than that 34 grand that you're likely to accept, maybe unwillingly, but you're likely to accept to forgo the trouble and the other expense. And so that's where the negotiation is played, within those boundaries. How far will you go to avoid going through the process and giving the guy the spanking he probably truly deserves, but that's going to cost you money? And what does your contract say in terms of who picks up the costs of that arbitration? That's the other place you should be looking. Because if you've got a good case and you've got what's frequently called a prevailing party provision that whoever wins, the other side writes the check not only for the settlement but also for the winning side's costs, that again is something that plays into your advantage and significantly. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
What happens if you're dealing with a person who has no empathy or really just doesn't care, it's more of a game to them or anything like that, but you know, the nice thing would be is just to walk away, but if you don't have that option, you're dealing with the person, you're trying to finalize a deal, what techniques or what kind of experiences have you guys had that was the best way to deal with these things?
Should we each write down 5 names and see if we have any comment? Dan, you want to take first shot?
Those situations are difficult because you're not dealing with somebody who's thinking about this rationally. They're not playing by the rules. And in that situation, I think your preparation, as Paul was saying just a second ago, is more important than ever. That you've got to have the backup, you've got to have the documentation, you've got to have the proof. Everyone wants to see the proof. Show it to me. Let me see something because I know I didn't do anything wrong here. So the preparation is important, and you really do have to think about you go through some of these techniques here. Think about your options. Do you have options to a negotiated settlement? Is arbitration or litigation an option? You do that preparation so that when you talk to this person, you can lay out the whole picture for them, and you can say, okay, maybe we don't have agreement that you caused this problem, but that's my position. You did cause this problem. Here's why I'm saying that. I've got this information. I've got the support for it, and these are the things that are available to me, and I want to let you know that because I want you to know what my position is, so you understand it, and what the consequences are. And my desire is to resolve this in a way that I guess it depends on what your situation is. If the person is completely unreasonable, it's probably not a kind of business situation that you want to look to the next deal for. So maybe you're not thinking about aligning your interests for the next project because maybe you just want to settle this thing and be done and never deal with that again. But you still do need to sort of go through some of these considerations. Maybe empathy isn't going to do it here. It's not going to carry the day, but the preparation is important, and letting them know that you're not going to back down, that this is what you need to accomplish out of this, and letting them know that you're prepared to see it all the way through.
And then you get out the brass knuckles. And we talked about knowing your opponent and knowing how they operate. There are bullies out there, and I think bullies often don't like to be bullied. I've been in some aggressive negotiations. I've said, what we've talked about is something, we try to advance here this morning was something that in 95% of the situations when you've got reasonable people on both sides, or people who want, even if are looking to try to get something that may be a mutually beneficial resolution of a contract, of a problem, those are the kind of techniques. But sometimes you do have to be tough. And sometimes people test you by being unreasonable, by being obstructionist. That may be the time to be face-to-face and get in his beard. And it may be, and that's also a time when you consider those other alternatives. Is this something where you do have other alternatives? And threatening those other alternatives, well, if you're going to sit down like this, you're going to take this approach, we can sure go to court. And it's going to cost both of us a whole lot of money, or we can see if we can get this done here today. I mean, it's something, again, sometimes things get tough, and then you have to be prepared to be tough, and you have to be prepared to go and not back down. Again, I don't think, personal insinuations or those types of things ever are productive. I mentioned bullies don't like to be bullied. Bullies are also most likely to scream to everybody about how you said this, taking it out of context. So, again, keep it on the issues, keep it tough, keep it confident, but consider those other resolutions. And again, this is really, truly the time where you come in with as much preparation as possible, as much documentation as possible, and just call their bluff and force them to give you some explanations.
Yeah, this stuff doesn't have to go out the window just because the other person is completely unreasonable. The bully doesn't like to be bullied, so you use that technique where you're presenting options rather than ultimatums. I mean, they may be thinly veiled ultimatums, but it's the option of this is what I need to get, or it's litigation. I mean, that's an option. It's not much of one, but think about what options you could put on the table, so that you're not completely backing this person into a corner. You're letting them make a choice as to how they're going to get themselves out.
Anybody else?
How do you guys deal with ego problems with certain customers or clients or whatever? How do you guys kind of handle that?
Well, we all have them. Both egos and those that we see as having people we deal with who have egos larger than ours. I mean, if they're your customers, obviously you're going to do what you can to forgive 1,000 sins. If you're in a negotiation with somebody, I mean, it's whatever's most effective. Again, knowing that the person is going to be taking that kind of approach, that they've never done anything wrong in their entire life, that they've never come out second best in any deal. You know that going in, and you have to prepare yourself as best as you can, and you have to prepare more so for that type of person. It may be something where instead of trying to do things on the phone, you recognize that and say, listen, we have an issue, or we have an opportunity, whichever it may be, whether it's a transaction or whether it's working out a problem. And I think it probably makes sense for us to get together and talk about it. Let's sit down, have a cup of coffee, see if we can work through and see if we have the potential for a resolution here. I've certainly dealt with quite a number of unreasonable people. I've also dealt, and I don't know if other people in this room may have, there's organizations just have a corporate culture that, and I don't remember who said it, and it certainly isn't true today, but sometime back in the late 40s, the then president of General Motors said, what is good for General Motors is good for the United States, which is kind of that type of attitude, that type of ego I think you may be referring to, where, and I've dealt with corporations that have that culture. They just believe that they are somehow superior. I had a good opportunity in representing a client up north who had some surplus real estate adjacent to his financial institution, and a national big box retailer was putting together a development and had bought a couple of adjacent parcels and discovered there was some wetlands on one of those parcels, and that left them short in terms of land they needed for the store they were planning on putting in and the development they were planning on doing. And they had payments due on their contracts for that other parcels. There was a lot of momentum going with the city agreement. And so I was in a very unusual position where I had a seller who really wasn't looking to sell, a buyer who was desperate to buy and had unlimited financial resources, but a buyer was always very used to getting their own way, and timing. I mean, I had the trifecta, and we got a very, very good deal. And having done 2 other deals with that retailer, I can guarantee you they're not used to giving away those things. So, you know, again, you're dealing with a corporate culture, you're dealing with an individual with that kind of ego. You do what you can. And sometimes, you know, if it's a business transaction, what is the cost of the transaction? I mean, is the benefit worth the aggravation? And I'm sure everybody in this room has made that decision about somebody at some point or another. And sometimes we can't walk away from those.
Yeah, in my experience, there's 2 kinds of people with those ego problems, and you got to deal with them differently. It's somebody that's got a big ego, that's got a lot of bluster or whatever, and they want somebody to stand up to them, and so then you got to do that.
And they don't respect you unless you
And
do.
they won't respect you unless you do. And the other kind is somebody that just has a big ego and needs it to be stroked every once in a while. So if you take a really conciliatory approach and, you know, recognize that you're in the presence of greatness, and, you know, it can be really effective. You know, they sort of, right, yeah, you know, you get them back on their heels a little bit, and then they're like, oh, okay, you know, you're not so bad. Let's do a deal.
Anybody else? Well, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Dennis.